Wolf, wolf. There's a wolf on the plains. Everybody run and hide. Isn't that the truth? I got out my book, The Complete Guide of Worst Case Scenarios. And I'm going to leave it up to Art, but we are still in a situation where Art shared this, several weeks ago, maybe even a couple months ago. Beware of the headlines and what that really means. And it just reminded me that last split second before the timer hit zero is, it's like that guy who stands outside yelling wolf. At what point do you stop believing them? So let's bring on our host and our amazing expert. That's Art Alvarez. Welcome to Mortgage Minute. Hey, Art, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Jeff. How are you?
Good. Watch out for wolves out there, Art.
I'm always looking out for them, for sure.
You just never know what's going to come out of this side of the camera, do you?
That's right. Yeah, I'm always anxious to see what you got to start us off.
Yeah, that was all of a sudden I looked over on my bookshelf and I say, wait a second, I've got a complete guide to worst case scenarios. And I think on page 275, be aware of headlines, people predicting the economic conditions in your country. Crazy stuff. It says you should refer to Art.
Yeah.
So what's happening?
Well, it's been an interesting, actually, it's interesting. It's been a quiet week as it relates to the mortgage market and interest rates and so forth. Of course, today, not quite the same. We've had a little bit of a jolt to the system, but which I'll talk about. But, as you just discussed or referred to, I think you have to be a little bit careful of the market reaction and what the headlines are in relation to what occurred today with bond yields, because I think it's could be a little bit of a head fake.
Do you remember when that commercial was always on? It said, hey, when they talk, people listen.
Oh, yeah.
That E.F. Hutton thing. I mean, I know that's been gone for probably 2 decades. So some people are like,
or more.
Yeah, or more. But there's somebody in our world right now. It's like every time they say something, everybody's leaning in. And at that point, I think I'll turn it over to you. But before I let you go, hey, for those of you joining us live, I'll be manning the Q&A. So if you have a question or a comment on what Art is talking about, or maybe you have a question outside of what Art is talking about, please put it in the comments. That's on YouTube or Facebook. We're live on both. And put your question there, and we'll bring it back to Art, and he'll give you an answer. Because let's face it, MortgageWorks, if you have a question, he has the answers, and they're on the house. So, Art, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone. Art Alvarez at MortgageWorks, where we do have the answers, and they're on the house. Here's this week's Mortgage Minute coming to you from Palm Springs, California, where it's going to get a little toasty this weekend. In fact, I think the predictions are we'll be at 113 tomorrow and 115 on Saturday. So I guess we could call that Palm Springs is a hot market, right? That's a little bit of a pun, obviously. So as I always do, I want to start off with giving you an update as to where we are on mortgage rates and the financial markets and the bond market in particular. You can see here, Jeff just pulled it up, where we're at in terms of mortgage rates currently. A little bit of an uptick in rates. We're pretty much solidly in the 6s, even for FHA loans. But still, we're relatively stable with rates. But today was kind of interesting because while the bond market has been very, very stable in terms of the 10-year yield all week, that did change significantly this morning. The market opened this morning. I saw it early in the day. And you can see here on the 5-day chart, we jumped up to 3.85 when we've been running between 370 to 373, 374 all week. So what's going on there? What caused this uptick? Well, as it turns out, the uptick occurred because there was a release today of a revision in the first quarter GDP. Originally, when the first quarter GDP came out, it was at 1.3%. Well, today that was revised to 2%. So, pretty good jump. And so as a consequence, the bond market reacted swiftly and significantly with the yield going up to that about 385 level that you saw on the previous chart. And it reminds me years ago, I remember seeing a quote from an economist who, in referring to the financial markets, would say that they respond with reptilian-like minds to stimuli. And I always thought that was a clever observation of financial markets, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. And what I mean by that is quite often when economic data is released, the markets can sometimes react not just quickly, but significantly. And then what happens is once that data has really been absorbed and analyzed, oftentimes that negative initial reaction will calm down, moderate, and things kind of get back on track. And I'm going to be so bold as to suggest that I think may be happening today. Because after all, first quarter GDP is old news. Okay, it's been revised from 2% from 1.3, but again, that's past history. And I think right now we've got to focus on current conditions and what we think is going to happen in the next couple of quarters and into next year. Now, I've talked before how there are still a lot of mixed signals in that regard, but otherwise, I think there's still more to focus on now and going forward rather than what happened with the GDP. So as I said, overall, I think bond yields have been stable, and I think this uptick today will settle down. However, what else could happen this week? We're down to the last day of the week before the holiday weekend, and that is tomorrow a release of a pretty important data point. That's the PCE, also known as personal consumption expenditures. And that is considered what's called core inflation because it excludes energy and food prices. That's being released tomorrow. Now, if that number comes out low or lower than expected, I would expect that the markets are going to react favorably to that. And as a consequence, that uptick in the 10-year bond yield, which is our best barometer for mortgage rates, likely will settle down. Now, if it turns out that number is higher than expected, then today's uptick could worsen. My guess is we're going to see the other way, that the PCE may end up being either the same or maybe slightly better. So again, for any of you who really focus on this stuff, take a look at the financial markets early tomorrow morning to see what that PCE number is, and then take a look at the 10-year bond yield, and you'll see what kind of reaction we're going to get. So with that, I wanted to talk about, again, this whole issue of recession and the mixed signals about a recession. And what I want to bring up is something regarding the yield curve. Now, that's something in economics that's a pretty well-known topic. And what is the yield curve? What is that all about? Well, the yield curve from an economic standpoint is generally focused on the 2-year Treasury yield and the 10-year Treasury yield. And normally, the short-term bond, the 2-year bond, is going to have a lower yield than a long-term or 10-year bond. Why? Because investors would normally see a 10-year bond as carrying more risk because that's an investment over a longer term. And so in the normal circumstance, there'll be an upward slope between the 2-year Treasury yield and the 10-year Treasury yield. Well, that's changed. In fact, that's been inverted, believe it or not, for about a year, where we have this what's called inverted yield curve. In fact, right now, the 2-year Treasury yield currently, and this includes today's reaction, is at 4.891. While the 10-year, even with the increase from earlier in the week, is still about 1% below. We're at 3.855. So that means that curve is inverted. Now, why is that significant? Well, the idea here, first of all, is when you see this kind of inversion, what it's referring to is investors are expecting a near-term decline in economic activity, and that's going to have to force the Fed to cut interest rates. And so the issue, though, is that may take a while. And, in addition to the fact that this is a pretty good indicator, the other thing that's going on is the leading economic index, which measures things like building permits, weekly hours worked, manufacturing orders. Remember the cardboard box recession we talked about a month or so ago? That index has fallen for 14 months straight. Now, that may change a little bit with building permits because those are on the rise. But overall, that's a pretty long time for this index to have been falling. So that's a pretty strong signal of a coming recession. And when you have an inverted yield curve, historically, this is a lagging indicator, but it's been highly predictive since 1969. And the average period of time between when the yield curve inverts and when we see the start of a recession is about 15 months. And the inversion of the yield curve occurred about June of 22. So if you do the math, 15 months from then means we could be looking at a recession as early as about October of this year. So again, this is a very strong indicator of recessions, and I would argue it is a better indicator of a recession coming than the kind of, I think, outdated notion that a recession is 2 quarters of GDP growth. That has always historically been a common data point to be looked at to declare that we're in a recession. But I would argue that's not as accurate. And this inverted yield curve is a much better indicator. So that being the case, again, there's a lot of mixed signals still about the economy, but I think the inverted yield curve is a better guide, a better gauge of what's going to happen. And so I continue to believe that that recession is probably going to occur. Maybe it's not 15 months from the inversion point. Maybe it's going to be 18 months, maybe 20 months. But still, I think that means we're going to see some sort of recessionary environment in the relative near future, maybe fourth quarter of this year going into the first quarter of next year. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, I want to move now to talking about housing starts. And all the news in terms of housing starts and new home sales, that has been in the news quite a bit lately. And housing starts are surging. New home sales are surging, basically. And I want to talk about, what does that mean if you're selling homes? What does that mean if you're a realtor? Now, why is home starts and home sales surging? Well, we've talked about it a lot. It has to do with existing home inventory. The inventory of existing homes for sale is still very low in many markets. And when, home builders are very good at, identifying that and realizing that they can then start more homes to add to the inventory and take advantage of that opportunity. And in that regard, new home sales historically are usually about 10, maybe 15% of total sales. But that's changing. New home sales are now approaching, I think in April, they're about 15% of the total. They're now approaching 30% of the total sales nationally, which is quite a bit more than, again, we've seen historically. So given that that's the case, what does that mean if you're selling homes? Well, a couple of things. If you're a listing agent, and oh, by the way, I'm a mortgage guy, but I have had some experience selling homes in the past. I've had a real estate license for almost 40 years. And in fact, after the big crash of 2008, for a period of time, we at MortgageWorks here, we were selling REOs because the mortgage business was sort of not doing so well. So I have had some experience in listing and selling homes. And for listing agents, I would suggest that you need to understand that new homes, at least depending on the market you're in, may very well be your competition. And I think you have to be cognizant of that for a couple of reasons. For one, new home builders are very good, as I've mentioned this before, they're very good at understanding that financing incentives tied to mortgage rates and closing costs are a very powerful, effective tool to get their home sold. So if I'm a listing agent and if I'm looking to list a property that may be a product, that particular home may be competing against similar homes that are being offered by new home builders in that market, I think you need to be aware of that. Understand that that home builder is your competition. Try to have that discussion with your seller that you may be, having, very strong competition from that nearby home builder, that nearby new home sales office or new home tract, and that you need to be cognizant of that when you decide and discuss with your seller, what price you should list your home at. And I would argue that in that regard, it may make a lot of sense to maybe take a look around at the new home communities in your market near that listing, see what they're doing, and then have that discussion with your seller about should you develop a strategy when you list that home to maybe offer similar incentives. I think that's something that a lot of realtors, and in particular owners of existing homes, I'm not sure that they've really warmed up to that, even though the mortgage industry has talked about interest rate buy downs for quite a while now. We're seeing that occurring mostly with new homes. Existing home sales, while there are some buy downs being done, paid for by the seller, it's still not a very significant part of the market. So I would really urge listing agents to kind of relook at that. Again, if your listing in your market is going to be competing with new home communities nearby. And so, obviously there's a cost involved to your seller if you're going to offer any kinds of incentives like this, but that's part of deciding your pricing strategy, right? You may want to, inch up that initial list price a little bit, but put in, big, bold comments in your listing that price includes some very significant incentives to the prospective buyer. And I think that will get you some attention in terms of traffic to look at the homes and hopefully some offers. Now, what does this mean for buyers agents? What does new homes, more housing starts and new home sales surging, what does that mean for a buyer's agent? Well, it's both a challenge and an opportunity. As it relates to an opportunity, keep in mind, of course, many home builders, particularly the national home builders, they do what they call broker co-op. What that means is, as a resale agent, you can take a prospective home buyer and you can take them to the new home sales office, register them, and if that home builder is co-oping, which means they're going to pay you a commission, that may be something to look at. Now, I was almost hesitant to say that in the program today because, of course, most new home communities, particularly from the national home builders, and I would argue that is in a lot of markets where most of the new home communities are coming from. In other words, from the big national home builders, most all of them are in the mortgage business. They have a division that offers mortgages, and they'll offer their incentives only if you use their lender. Now, that's not always the best deal, and so I would encourage anybody who's looking at that to still get a second opinion, if you will, like from somebody like us, where we can show you what kind of terms we can offer. We may not always be able to compete with what that home builder is offering in terms of incentives, but sometimes the kind of loan terms you're going to get for those incentives are not as good as you might think they are, or that they should be, actually. So just keep that in mind. And then the other thing is, in that same regard, when you're looking at, if you're not looking at new homes, you're looking at a resale. And I had this happen again today. I had an agent call me, wants to look at submitting an offer on a existing home listing where it's listed at $649, and she talked to her buyer and they were discussing offering $620. And again, I said, no, don't do that. Consider offering that full list price and take that $29,000 difference that would have occurred if you were able to get your $620 offer price accepted, which they might because the home has been on the market for 110 days. I said, no, really rethink that. Offer full price, but take that $29,000 and use it toward an interest rate buy down and closing costs. And in fact, when I sent the agent the numbers, what I was able to show is that they could buy down the rate to under 5% permanently for 30 years. That was like 1.25% below current market rate with no points. And in addition, the cost of that was such that it didn't use the whole $29,000. They could use the rest, which was about $5,000, toward closing costs. So it was a dual benefit to the agent's buyer, where they could get a much lower rate, below 5%, still get $5,000 applied toward their closing costs. In my mind, that's a much better deal. And I went ahead and showed them what the numbers would be at $620 with market rate and no closing cost incentive. And it was a significant difference. So again, if you're a buyer's agent, I would strongly urge you to keep that in mind, particularly if you're contemplating just offering below list. Rethink that, or at least get another set of numbers where these kind of incentives are involved. Talk to your buyer about it, and then decide where you want to go from there in terms of submitting your offer. So that's what I have to say in regards to the new housing start and new home sales news that's been going on, what it means for all the realtors out there. Hopefully that's helpful, and it'll help you compete with those new home communities. Now with that, and given the current circumstances, again, we're still dealing with, in a lot of markets, pretty low inventory because of all these homeowners who are locked into their low rates, don't want to sell. And the fact that, rates are where they're at. I want to reiterate something I've talked about before, and that's equity lending, and why it matters. Because given everything I keep saying about homeowners ought to consider, if you really need or want to sell, that you maybe consider selling and then using these, interest rate buy downs and closing costs credits from sellers when you make your offer. Despite that opportunity, some sellers are still going to decide to hold firm, and they may even decide they don't need to buy a new, bigger, nicer home, and instead consider staying put and then tap into that equity. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, why it matters, and what homeowners who have very low first mortgage rates, who are locked in, they don't want to sell, where do they go from here? And in that regard, I want to point out that equity loans can serve multiple purposes. Now, the most common reason that equity lending is done these days, and I would say for the most part, most of the HELOCs that we've been arranging, and it's been mostly HELOCs, not fixed rate seconds, although we have those too, is for debt consolidation. That's probably the number one reason folks who own homes with very low first mortgage rates are looking at getting an equity loan, is to, in fact, consolidate their debt. Credit card interest rates are 25%. Even with a fixed rate second or a HELOC that might be somewhere hovering around a 10% rate, that's less than half of what their current consumer debt interest rate costs are. So that's a very compelling reason why an equity loan makes a lot of sense. But that's not the only reason you should consider an equity loan. There's lots of others. For example, home improvement. If you're thinking about you want a bigger home, nicer home improvement may be a better way to go. Stay put, keep enjoying that 2.5-3% mortgage, tap into that equity, remodel your house, maybe do a room addition. If you don't have a pool already, put in a pool. There's multiple ways you can renovate your home with an equity loan. And that probably is, I would say, the second most common reason folks look at an equity loan is for that purpose. But there can also be some other uses. In fact, last week I was at a trade group meeting, and I was sitting at a table with someone in the solar business, someone I've actually known for several years. And we got to talking about solar systems and how they're financed. And he actually pointed out that solar loans, by and large, are really not very good loans. They typically have, high rates. In particular, though, you can get, with some of these solar loans, you can get the rate much lower, but the fees involved for doing that were pretty unreasonable. And with some of them, there's even a provision where within the first 18 months, you have to pay down the solar loan balance in order to preserve whatever interest rate incentive they're offering you. And in fact, as we were discussing this gentleman actually declared, which was music to my ears, he said, if I was a homeowner looking to put solar in my home and I had the equity, I think the best way to finance that is, he said a HELOC, an equity loan. Again, it can be a fixed rate, doesn't have to be a HELOC. But he declared that pretty definitively that he thought, and this is again somebody who's been in the solar business for quite a few years, that's the best way to finance a solar system. And I would of course agree. Obviously, that's a little bit self-serving since I'm in the business of lending people money, which it does include equity loans. But I think he's right, and I've encountered several homeowners who are contemplating a solar system and was able to show them that an equity loan is actually a better way to finance it. But equity loans can be also used for other things like starting a business or construct an ADU on your property. Again, if you've got a property with a lot of equity, you've got a very low first mortgage rate. If your lot's big enough, you might want to consider getting an equity loan to construct an ADU on your property. That can either be used for other family members who are visiting you, or you could potentially even rent it out. And then that's the other thing I wanted to point out, which I think a lot of homeowners don't realize. In a lot of markets, not all, having a rental property can be a pretty good thing financially. So if you don't already have the funds in your savings account, your investment account as a down payment to buy a rental property, you can tap into your equity through a HELOC or a fixed rate second and pull out enough cash that can be used as the down payment for an investment property. That's an acceptable way of borrowing money for your down payment to buy another home. And in that regard, you can purchase either a rental property, a long-term rental, or a STR, that's short-term rental. Now, a little comment on that short-term rental part. There has been some news lately that the short-term rental market in some parts of the country is showing some signs of weakening. In fact, there's you all probably have heard of Airbnb. Well, as it turns out, Airbnb is seeing about a 50% reduction in revenue in short-term rentals in some markets. That's pretty substantial. And what's interesting about that is that in some of these markets, the number of short-term rental properties actually exceeds the number of existing homes for sale. So that suggests that some of those markets have a whole bunch of short-term rentals that are experiencing a severe reduction in their revenue. And that, of course, suggests some of those homes could hit the market and be sold soon, which, of course, would be helpful because that would increase inventory. And in fact, I looked at that data in the top 15 markets where there has been a dramatic decline in Airbnb revenue on short-term rentals. Thankfully, none of the 15 were in California. And I would argue in our specific market here in the Coachella Valley and probably Southern California overall, the short-term rental market is still pretty strong. So keep that in mind. You can use that equity, pull that out through HELOC or a fixed rate second, use that as your down payment to purchase a rental property, either a long-term traditional 12-month type lease with a tenant or a short-term rental. It can be a pretty effective way to get into the rental, the investment property ownership situation, which can, of course, be good for you financially long-term. So again, I just want to reiterate, equity lending is still here. It still matters. It's a very good option for those homeowners who are locked into their current homes with their very low rates. And even if they're contemplating selling for all the reasons I suggest you should, this could still be a very good alternative for all these reasons we mentioned. So moving on from that, I want to go ahead and get into last week's closing question. And if you recall, I indicated that the question was, what is an I-10 borrower? Okay, I-10 borrower. Well, what is I-10? Well, I-10 is individual taxpayer identification number. Now, what is an I-10 borrower? Why would somebody have that number? Well, it's primarily people who are non-US citizens, foreign nationals who don't have a Social Security number. So this program or these borrowers, they may be in the U.S., maybe for several years, they're working, they're paying taxes, which is why you have an I-10 number to start with. An I-10 number is for the purpose of being able to pay taxes to the federal government. That's the only purpose of the number. And so what happens with those folks if you don't have a Social Security number and you're not a U.S. citizen, but you still want to get financing to buy a home? Well, there is a market for this type of borrower. It's I-10 loans are part of the non-QM loan category. Remember, non-QM is non-qualified mortgage. That's that basket of loan programs for borrowers who don't meet conforming guidelines, who oftentimes need loan programs that allow for less documentation, limited documentation, to still get the loan approved. Now, there's trade-offs with these kind of loans because they are part of the non-QM loan basket. You are going to see higher down payments, but you can get it along with as little as 15% down. Your debt ratio can still be pretty high, up to 50%. And that can be determined either by what we call full doc, where maybe you have tax returns and pay stubs and so forth, or we can use reduced documentation approaches like bank statements or P&L only, that kind of thing. And your rates are going to be higher than a conforming loan, typically about 1% to 2% higher. But that's not terribly bad. I mean, again, I would argue 6% range is not that bad historically. So with these kind of loans, you may be looking at the 7s or 8s, but in the right circumstance, it's still a good option. And by the way, this type of program is also eligible for DACA borrowers. That's those particular borrowers who came here as children are not, U.S. citizens. This is a program that will still serve them as well. So for anyone out there, whether you're a homeowner or a realtor, if you've encountered anyone who has an I-10 number and they would like to get into home ownership, there is an option. We'd be happy to talk to them about it. Feel free to refer them to us, and we'll see what we can do to help them get a home. And it's particularly gratifying if they've never owned a home before, since they've been in the U.S. and have this number. We'd love the opportunity to be able to help them achieve that ownership goal. So that's the I-10 borrower. Keep that in mind for anyone who's under that category. So with that, I want to go ahead and finish up with our closing question for next week. Got another acronym for you, and that is, what is a DSCR loan? So again, what is a DSCR loan? So we'll have that to talk about next week. And in the meantime, and when we do talk about it, when I give you the answer, it'll be on the house. And with that, Jeff, back to you.
Hey, welcome back, Art. Yeah, that was some good information. I can't wait till tomorrow morning to see, what was that called? The PCE number?
PCE, personal consumption expenditure. Again, that's also known as core inflation because it excludes food and energy prices.
And you said if that number is higher, what happens?
Well, if the number is higher than the markets expect, then that would be an indication that maybe inflation's not getting tamed as much as we thought. And again, we may, as a result, see that same kind of reptilian-like mind reaction by the markets where the bond yields could spike up further. Now, if it turns out that it comes in at a number that's expected or below what's expected, as we've seen with the PPI and the CPI, again, consumer price index and producer price index, last couple of months, those have been coming in lower than expected, which of course is kind of reassuring evidence that inflation is getting under control. So if the PCE comes in as expected or lower, that could be another signal that inflation is getting reined in. And then as a consequence, maybe that will help the Fed slow down or stop their strategy to keep raising rates to get inflation back to 2%. Again, Powell for the last week or two has been pretty vocal about, hey, folks, we're not done. We have more to do. We think there's going to be at least 2 more increases this year, possibly back-to-back, July, August kind of a thing. I think if the PCE comes in better than expected, that may moderate the potential for that strategy.
So with the idea of is a recession coming? Is it not coming? When you talked about the inverted bond yield, I didn't realize it had been inverted for as long as it has, and that is such a true indicator. Would you say back to 1969 has been pretty darn accurate?
Yes. Since 1969, the inverted yield curve phenomenon has been highly predictive as to a recession coming after the inversion occurs. Again, it takes time. It can be anywhere from 8 to 10 months to upwards of 20 months before that happens. Of course, we've been in an inverted yield curve now for about a year, and it looks like that's going to continue for a while. And because it's so highly predictive, I think that's probably your best indicator of when, if and when a recession's coming. I think the 2 quarters of negative GDP is really not as good of or as reliable as of an indicator as we used to think. So.
Well, and I know that is going to drive the rates a little bit. I'm interested to see what happens tomorrow morning with the 10-year Treasury to see if that goes up or down based on the news. And I wanted to ask one question because this often comes up with people that says, "Hey, I've gone to Art, I've locked in a rate because I'm looking at a home. But what happens when there is a spike one way or the other with a rate? How am I as a borrower impacted with that?"
Well, it depends. I mean, if you're in a situation where you've applied for the mortgage and maybe you've actually opened an escrow and if you lock in your rate at the start, which is what I recommend because the risk is too great. I mean, because things are still a little bit volatile, I don't think it's worth the risk of floating the market if you've initiated a loan application on a particular transaction, because you could lose. Rates could go up on you, even if you think they're going to go the other way. I mean, that's again where you're trying to guess the market. So in this environment, I think it's always best to, when you apply for the loan, lock it right away. And that's true even if we've got some lenders where we can initiate an application, get it fully approved under what's called a TBD underwriting, where the property is to be determined later. But in the meantime, you can get your loan fully approved, so you're in a better situation when you make your offer to show, hey, I'm not just pre-qualified. I've had a lender look at my stuff, formally underwrite it, and I'm approved. Here it is, and here are the conditions. Which, if you do it right, it'll be nothing more than the appraisal. And we can actually, even in that circumstance, lock in a rate for a pretty long period of time. And then, of course, what happens is when a borrower, whether you initiate an application in either of those 2 scenarios I just described, they'll say, well, what happens if after I lock and the market improves? Do I get the better rate? Yes and no. What happens is with most any lender that we deliver loans to, there's an opportunity to do what's called an interest rate renegotiation. The general terms are as follows. You've locked in a rate, you're going along, getting your loan approved on a purchase, and say maybe a week, 2 weeks into the process, rates have fallen dramatically. We can go back to that lender and request a renegotiation of the rate, of the locked rate. Now, typically that involves a fee. On average, it's about 0.5 point of the loan amount.
Hmm.
Now, that could be a pretty sizable amount of cash, depending on what your loan amount size is. So the most common way to absorb that fee for renegotiating your rate lock is to absorb it in the new rate. So, for example, let's say you've locked in at 6.5, and before you've got your loan ready to close, the market rate has dropped from 6.5 to 6. Well, what we would do, and I do this even before I share the opportunity with the borrower, I just do it for them. I go to my lender and say, hey, we want to renegotiate the rate. And let's say the market, as I said, the market rate was at 6, even though you had locked at 6.5. So what you do is, to absorb that 0.5%, you can get the rate renegotiated not to the current 0.6% rate. Instead, you renegotiate it to a lower rate than your rate lock, but say to 6.125, 6 1/8. That extra eighth in rate absorbs that 0.5 point renegotiation fee. So it's not paid with dollars. It's simply absorbed in that slightly higher rate, but it's still a win for the borrower because they were able to avoid any worsening of rates when they started the transaction and still be able to grab a better rate if the market improves before they close their purchase.
What a great idea.
That's a opportunity that's been actually, frankly, available for years. So.
And that's the kind of service you're going to get whenever you're working with someone like Art, who's been in the business for now 40 plus years and has had MortgageWorks here serving the Coachella Valley in Southern California for decades. His number's on the screen. It's, if you want to call the office, it's 760-883-5700. Or as always, he has that red flashing phone in his pocket called the Bat Phone at 714-612-9035. That's his cell. And of course, you can always go to the website and find out, hey, what are the rates going for today? We showed that at the very beginning. There's always a rate chart there that's been updated. And of course, you can send Art an email if you wish. But again, don't forget, the Bat line is the best way to get a hold of Art at 714-612-9035. Art, it is a holiday next week. How is that going to affect the markets with Tuesday being July the 4th, Independence Day?
Well, the markets will be closed on Tuesday. And of course, even Monday, markets will be open, but it's probably going to be relatively stable. Not likely much is going to go on either way in terms of stocks or bonds. So really, after tomorrow, when we see that PCE number, I don't think we'll really see any significant changes going on until after the holiday, next Wednesday, the 5th.
Well, with that, hey, have a great holiday weekend. Make sure if you're handling any fireworks, I don't know if they're legal everywhere in California, but a lot of places they're not. Make sure you throw it, turn, and run. And remember, those little snakes you put on the sidewalk, they leave a mess. So clean up after you're done. With that, my name is Jeff Harrison with Art Alvarez of MortgageWorks, and you have been with Mortgage Minute every Thursday at 2 p.m. Remember, if you have questions, please put them in the comments because we have the answers and they're on the house. Art will be there to help you out. Thank you so much, Art. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Jeff. You too. Have a great weekend. And since you keep talking about my Bat Phone, I'll see if I can bring my cape next week.
Super. Thank you.
In the meantime, thanks everybody for listening and watching. And we'll see you next week. Have a great 4th of July holiday. And as Jeff said, remember, at MortgageWorks, we do have the answers and they're on the house. Take care.